Good morning, everyone. I can't tell. Elizabeth, are we set to record? Is everything?
I just started the recording, yes.
Very good. Okay. And some of you may discern that I'm not speaking to you from my regular location, from my study. We have a blackout here. We had a big storm.
Oh, that's right.
It knocked the electricity out on Tuesday, and it looks like it won't be back till next Tuesday. And of course, without electricity, I don't have Wi-Fi. Without Wi-Fi, I can't talk to you. So I'm in a doctor's office. My partner is a doctor, and you may see this stuff behind me. Anyway, that's where I'm talking to you from today. She was nice enough to let me use her office. It's good to be back with you. And it's been quite a week for me. I hope it's been a little smoother for you, but it's not bad enough that we have a coronavirus pandemic, a major economic recession, all of these changes at the college that I'm trying to cope with. Then they got to knock the lights out too. So I had to email Elizabeth and say, can I look at the link from last week's lecture? I'm not sure I remember where I left off. But I was able to look at the link, and I know where we left off. And so I'm going to jump in. And it's my hope, hope springs eternal, that I will maybe get pretty close to finishing this lecture with you, this entire lecture series with you today. And I'll just point out to you what that means. I've just gone back and done the math, is essentially we will have done 16 lectures on this topic. Usually our lecture series together are 8 weeks or 8 lectures. And this one we interrupted occasionally to talk about George Floyd and the coronavirus and other things in our politics. But we really did do a sustained and in-depth study of inequality. And I do want to congratulate you for your patience, your fortitude, your devotion to this topic, and in particular, to point out to you that at this point, you've essentially done a semester's worth of work on this subject. So welcome back to college. The final will be next week. And you should feel accomplished. You should feel like I hope you do feel like you've acquired some fairly in-depth knowledge about the nature of the rise of inequality in the contemporary United States as well as globally, about the forces driving it, whether that's globalization, automation, the decline of unions, changes in the political culture. All of these combine to increase our inequality. What the increase in inequality is doing to us in terms of our physical health, as well as our individual psychological well-being, what it's also doing to our society, to our democracy. We've looked at this from a number of different angles, including also the effort to plumb the depths of moral and political philosophy to say, well, I'm an egalitarian, but how confident should I be in that intuition? It feels right, but is it just me, just my ideology, just my upbringing, or is there a more objective foundation for our ideological intuitions about equality? And I've tried to provide you some fairly rigorous arguments to demonstrate that the best understanding of contemporary moral and political philosophy reaches highly egalitarian conclusions as well. And so the title for today's lecture, right? So I'm looking at proposals for restoring a fair and cooperative economy in the 21st century. And I'm putting it into 2 categories: low-hanging fruit and moonshots, right? And so those are the opposite ends of the extreme of what's possible. A simpler, more wonky way of putting this is stage 1 reforms and stage 2 reforms, where stage one reforms are things that we might be able to accomplish in the next year, right? That we might be able to do even absent the capacity to break the logjam in Washington, D.C., which is so painfully on display at the moment, with the talks around the stimulus bill having broken down despite the mounting evidence of the deep and lasting economic damage that the coronavirus is doing to the American economy. That does not bode well for stage two, but I'll say a little bit more about that when we get there. But even if Washington remains polarized and therefore paralyzed, and obviously there's some hope that maybe the upcoming national election will, if not completely break the logjam, because of course it's rooted in our 18th century constitutional machinery and how hard it is to legislate, given the way in which powers are divided, checked, and balanced within the US constitutional framework. But nevertheless, right now, with divided government, with the House controlled by the Democrats, with the Senate and the presidency in the hands of the Republicans, with the current president's lack of focus on legislative details, we're in a kind of perfect storm for not getting anything done on the national level. You shouldn't be surprised, despite the tremendous human costs of the failure to extend the stimulus package. You should not be surprised that this has happened. And so stage two minimally requires a different set of players in Washington. But stage one is stuff that we might be able to do even with the current players in Washington, in part because of how dire the emergency is that's facing the country. You may remember Rahm Emanuel saying that we should not let a crisis go to waste. And obviously that's an ironic way of saying crises sometimes allow us to overcome some of the impediments to political action that give our legislative system a status quo bias. Maybe, just maybe in the midst of the pandemic, we can overcome it. But some of what I'm about to discuss with you also does not require national legislation. And I think that's extremely important given how dysfunctional Congress and the federal government is right now. We began last week discussing this, and so here are those stage one proposals. And as you can see, I have here what I'd like to call a comprehensive suite of equality promoting policy reforms. And one way to express this idea is by saying that in the middle of the 20th century, the United States managed to succeed in creating a genuinely middle-class society. A secure and robust middle class was the very heart of our economy. The largest portion of our population, roughly 60%, belonged to what economists would categorize as the middle class. And the middle class had genuine economic security, a sense of upward mobility, anchored a kind of progressive aspiration for American politics. Can we get back there, right? Fewer than 40% of Americans now qualify as what we call middle class, and many of them fear downward mobility and do not experience economic security as part of their middle class status. By the way we measure middle class is in terms of income and standard deviations away from a median income. And one of the things to note is that many of the people who count as middle class in the United States as a household are working 3, 4, 5 jobs to get there. And so again, if what's required to have a middle class income is that you stretch yourself incredibly thin in terms of the amount you have to work, it still does not feel very secure. So We started talking last week, and I'll just refresh your memory. I had to refresh my own about stage one reforms, and these are, like I say, the reforms that we might be able to accomplish right now. And the first set of reforms refer to a systematic job creation effort. And I kind of laughed with you last week and said, wait a second, you're going to put that in category one. We haven't been able to do this really effectively since the New Deal. Why isn't that hugely ambitious? And I pointed out to you, I believe it will sink in. I think the Republican Party is not there yet, but the depth of the economic crisis that we're in, the extent of the job losses. I didn't share new data with you. I wanted to concentrate on the policy reforms. Maybe next week I'll share some data with you. But what we're seeing is much greater job loss than job creation. That if we look at the total number of jobs lost and then subtract the new jobs created, we've still essentially lost 4 to 5 years worth of jobs in the last few months. And in addition to that, the jobs that have been lost are increasingly being categorized not as short-term or temporary job loss, but as permanent job loss. And given that the American economy is driven by consumption, given that consumption goes down when people don't have income for obvious reasons, right? They don't have the money to spend, and if they do have money saved, they're going to reserve that to get them through till they get another job. This is going to be extremely destructive for our economy unless and until we do something to create new jobs. And so I do think actually that it will be the case within the next 6 months at the most, that we will see broad-based support, maybe even bipartisan support for some job creation effort. And then what we need to do is target that job creation effort so that it is a middle class 21st century job creation effort. Obviously, I've put as an illustration in parentheses a Green New Deal. My hope for it would be that a fair number of these jobs would not just be traditional infrastructure jobs, but would be federally funded or at least supported jobs to put in place alternative energy sources, insulating homes, creating more efficient ways of heating and cooling homes. There's so much that we could be doing. I'll talk about light rail a little bit later, but things that we could be doing to make our society more energy efficient, because we do not want to lose track of the fact that in addition to the current pandemic, we are edging our way into a global environmental crisis with greenhouse gases and global climate change. And so, again, I think an intelligent policy planning process would say we need to create jobs. We need to do two things as we create those jobs. The first is to try to make them preparatory for stable 21st century jobs that helps us to rebuild the middle class. The second is to address our very inefficient energy infrastructure so that we stop polluting as much as we currently pollute. And so that's where we left off last week. I won't rehash that. But this is then going to lead into the second issue, which again, you may smile and say, systematic support for affordable housing, that's low-hanging fruit. I guess, you'll have to wait and see what the stage 2 stuff is, but this stuff is not easy. I recognize that it's not easy, but I would point out to you, if I've got my data right now, I'm still kind of stunned by the data that I'm seeing. 40% of Americans who rent their houses, their homes, their apartments, are currently behind on their rent. Depending on which state you live in, there may be or may not be, or it may be elapsing, an eviction moratorium due to the coronavirus. But eventually, these bills are going to come due. And when they come due, we're going to face not just a potential huge surge in homelessness. If 40% of renters, and by the way, it's about 40% of Americans who rent and don't own their property. So I'm not even talking about people who've fallen behind on their mortgages today. But if we get 40% of 40%, right, we're going to have tens of millions of people losing their homes, right? It's going to look like the Great Depression all over again. And if this coincides with the pandemic, it's going to create further complications in terms of the transmission if people lose their capacity to shelter in place, to wash their hands, to take care of themselves, right? And so you may be aware that one of the things that many states and municipalities have done is to really try to get the homeless off the street during the pandemic, because that's what public health tells you you need to do. All this to say, it will be a disaster, a human disaster, a public health disaster, if tens of millions of people lost their housing in a short period of time. But in addition to that, this is also a disaster for the landlords. And what may happen soon, if they don't have the capacity to collect rent, is that they may not be able to pay on their mortgages or meet their other obligations. And so this could be a kind of ripple effect crisis in which, if the landlords can't pay mortgages, then that affects banks as well as the security market, where many mortgages, as we know, are chopped up and sold as securities, and that affects liquidity, right? And so if you're hearing echoes of the 2007-2008 economic crisis, you're exactly right. So we need to do something in the short term to avoid a human, a public health, and a financial crisis, all coming out of problems with affordable housing. And again, my suggestion is that an intelligent policy planning process would not just attempt to address the symptom of the problem, right? The reason so many people have fallen behind in their rental payments during the coronavirus is in part because they're not working, they've lost their jobs, but many of them have been buoyed, have been supported by the supplement to the unemployment insurance benefit. With that falling off, things are going to get even worse. But the reason they're really falling behind is because too many people were spending 50% of their income or more on rent. And without going too far into the details, one of the things we know is that there are 5 major metropolitan areas in which 80% of the wealth is created in the United States. You happen to be sitting in one of them right now. I'm sitting in one of them. And we can add Los Angeles and Chicago and Washington, D.C. And very quickly, we see where most of the wealth in the United States is created. And these are all terribly expensive cities to live in. And the result is that people who want good jobs, who want economic mobility, are drawn to these cities, but then find themselves living in the outer ring exurbs of these cities, paying too much for rent, commuting too far. It's not viable, right? And so as opposed to just a Band-Aid for the current eviction crisis, it seems to me a second thing we should be doing to cope with what's happening to our country as a result of the pandemic. As I said at the very beginning of this lecture series, the coronavirus is spreading in the fault lines that inequality has opened in our society. It's exposing the problems that we face. A second major problem is affordable housing. We should use the fact that we're facing a major eviction crisis to not just keep people in their homes, but to begin working on systematic designs for mixed income housing, sufficiently proximate to where economic activity is located to allow more people to actually work good jobs in the places those good jobs are created. This will involve changing zoning so that we do have more multi-unit housing built in relatively expensive, perhaps recently gentrified areas, right? We've got to get over the idea that a nice neighborhood only has single family homes in it. We can build intelligent, mixed income, multi-unit residencies, apartment buildings in nice areas. But in addition to that, we're going to have to reckon with the fact that not everybody who works in San Francisco can live in San Francisco. Not everybody who works in Manhattan can live in Manhattan. And so the other thing that's part of a smart, affordable housing strategy is also a transportation infrastructure strategy. Light rail in particular seems to me to be the best option. Something like a much more extensive BART system or commuter rail system. And this then goes together with the idea of job creation, right? If the federal government invests in transportation around the places where the jobs are concentrated, more people can live further out, get to work without having to drive and without having to spend an inordinate amount of time getting to work. And so that's by the way, a green idea. The final thing I want to say about this is that although this goes best and really is only attainable on the scale that we need it, if the federal government is supporting it, because the federal government has the capacity to both tax and borrow in a way that the states and the localities don't. It can be started at the municipal level or even at the regional level. You may have seen that New York and Connecticut and New Jersey are cooperating in providing the infrastructure necessary to battle the coronavirus, including the testing and tracing infrastructure. I do think at this point we might think of California, Oregon, Washington, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, collaborating on regional affordable housing policy and overcoming some of the limits at the municipal or state level. All right, third idea here for equality promoting initiatives that might be accomplished in the next year, in which the fact of the coronavirus is used to leverage not just a reactive response, what we need to cope with the tremendous wreckage and suffering that the virus is producing, but leveraging it to produce long-term initiatives that address some of the problems in our society. And so the third area is healthcare reform. And I can imagine some of you may be laughing at the idea that this is low-hanging fruit. But let me just point out to you, as I've said, we're entering a phase now where, as opposed to temporary job losses, furloughs, et cetera, and oftentimes when workers are furloughed, temporarily let go or have their hours reduced, the employer maintains their health care coverage. But when unemployment becomes permanent, obviously the employer not only fires the worker, but also stops providing the benefits that were part of their overall compensation package. And this is happening to millions of people right now in this country. It has already happened probably to more than 10 million people. The data is a little hard to unpack, but certainly large numbers of people have lost their healthcare insurance. And what this points out is the limitations on a system in which the primary way that working age people get their healthcare insurance is employer-based, right? If you're working age, 70 to 80% of the population that has insurance gets its insurance through its employer, right? And the fact that Obamacare created hubs for purchasing insurance for yourself has allowed people who are self-employed, people who are employed but don't get healthcare benefits, people who are employed in the gig economy or as contract workers to get insurance at a somewhat affordable rate, but that's still a minority. If you're older, or if you're disabled, or if you are relatively poor, you can get it through Medicare or Medicaid. But for the most part, the dominant way in which healthcare insurance is still provided in our society is employee-based plans. And unfortunately, that doesn't work very well in a massive economic contraction in which tens of millions of people are losing their jobs. They're losing their insurance as well. And what we're going to see is a tremendous strain on the healthcare system. In certain respects, we're already seeing it. In certain respects, the fact that we rely on such an inefficient, decentralized system in which private insurers paid by employers are the main provider of healthcare, the main financier of healthcare in our society, is part of the reason. You may have seen the New York Times article yesterday, front page article. The United States has more coronavirus cases in the last 2 months than all of Europe, plus Canada, plus Australia, plus Japan, plus South Korea, areas that have double, at least, the population in the United States, and we have 5 times as many cases. Some of that has to do with incompetent leadership, obviously. Some of it has to do with federalism and our culture. Some of it has to do with the failure of our public health infrastructure. The fact that we cannot test people in less than a week to 10 days means that we're constantly guessing about how extensive the virus is in any particular locality. We're not detecting the spread until it's too late to contain it. That's a problem with our public health infrastructure, which is, I believe, ultimately rooted in our system of healthcare provision. And again, we need to fix this. I'm not going to go into the details of how to do it. And obviously, it took us more than 50 years to get Obamacare, as limited as that system is. We could talk about Medicare for all. We could talk about universal health care. We could talk about a public option in addition to the private insurance options under Obamacare. There are various ways to do this. But again, it seems to me that the critical thing to be focusing on is how much money people spend on health insurance in the United States today. How health insurance, in a sense, separates the economically secure from the economically precarious, and how unfair, how awful that is for us as a society. And that we, again, need to use what the virus is exposing as leverage to fix a long-term problem. Now, the last 2 items on my low-hanging fruit list here, I believe, are genuinely low-hanging fruit in the sense that this can be done without any federal legislation whatsoever. And so I'm going to mention reform in college admissions, and I will show you some data in a few minutes, but let me just point to one piece of data that I think really illuminates the nature of college admissions in the United States today. If you look at the most selective colleges and universities, these are roughly 38 schools. It includes the Ivy Leagues and Stanford and public Ivies. You get the general idea. These schools have as many students from the top 1% in their class as they do from the bottom 60% of the income distribution in the United States. I just find that staggering. What it reflects is the fact that selective higher education has become a luxury good in the United States, and that what we ask students to do to compete to get into a good college or university is primarily stuff that only people who come from affluent families can reliably do. Colleges and universities know this. Colleges and universities pretend that their admissions process is meritocratic, or that they're looking at the complete human being, the complete student, but they know, and the data is absolutely clear, that what it really takes to get admitted to a college or a university today is a level of expenditure that is really very difficult to manage if you don't come from the top 20% of society. And so we need to be honest about that. And we need to ask college by college, university by university, for reform in the admissions process. I will be spearheading such an effort at Sarah Lawrence in the coming semester. And, you know, I'm in a particularly good position to do that. I'm in the faculty of a reasonably selective college or university, but so many of us are graduates of colleges and universities. We participate in their alumni associations. We give to their fundraising enterprises. This gives us a certain leverage to start this conversation. And by the way, I believe that once this conversation is started, and if it gets sufficient attention, we should expect to see the kind of radical opinion change that we've seen with Black Lives Matter, right? In 3 months, we've gone from fewer than 40% of white Americans supporting Black Lives Matter to more than 2/3, right? That's a remarkable opinion change, and it does reflect things about the role that technology is playing in what might be called norm cascades, right? Changes in opinion that occur very quickly in light of the way technology spreads information. I suspect if we start bringing pressure to bear on colleges and universities, many of which are populated with their students, their faculty, their administration, relatively liberal individuals, we might find reform is actually low-hanging fruit. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to get into the details of what's going on with college admissions. Individual equality promoting behaviors. And so this is the lowest level, right? This is what we as individuals can do in our everyday life. And the first and most important thing, I think, is to not be an opportunity hoarder, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to the reform in college admissions for a moment. What is it that a child needs to do to get into college? And a lot of this is forms of what's called concerted cultivation or enrichment. They need to go to some kind of music lesson, learn to play the violin. They probably should do some kind of competitive sport, whether it's soccer or karate. They should maybe play chess or some sort of intellectual activity. They need academic tutors. Ideally, they should have some sort of interesting activities, whether that's hiking the Appalachian Trail or going to West Africa to work on inoculation, right? And by the way, a lot of wealthy parents hire a consultant when their child is in 9th or 10th grade. And that consultant says more or less what I just said to you, right? Do this and this and this. What are your child's strengths? Let's do these activities, right? This stuff is very expensive. And so let's start with this example. If you're the parent or the grandparent of a child who is aspiring to get into college, and you're thinking of spending $10,000 a year to get your child ready for college over the next 3 or 4 years, I'm not saying don't do it. That's unilateral disarmament, right? You shouldn't surrender your effort to get your child as good an education as they can get. But I guess what I would say is don't do it in a way that is hyper competitive, that excludes other children from also having a leg up in the college admissions process. And what that means in particular is if your child is going to this good summer camp and they've asked you for $4,000 to send them, or if your grandchild is going to a good summer camp, propose to the summer camp, I'd like to give you $5,000, not $4,000, but I'd like you to give a scholarship to a child who does not have the means to afford this. And in that way, try to broaden the opportunity that your child, your grandchild, your niece, your nephew, the person you're supporting is going to have. And so that's just an example, but we've become a much more competitive society. I've talked with you about when goods become scarce, competition goes up. When competition goes up, goods tend to be more scarce. I've talked with you a little bit about Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, and his claim, we'll get into some diagrams from his book in just a moment, that in the early 1960s in Port Clinton, Ohio, where he grew up, people looked out not just for their own child, but for their neighbor's child. They specifically thought about the kid who was less advantaged and tried to make sure that they had the equipment they needed to compete on the sports team, that they came along on the trip to the college as well as your own child. And that we should be thinking about the things that we can do to make our society less competitive, and in particular, to allow those who don't have the means to compete for the limited opportunities our society contains to gain some of the resources necessary to have at least a fair bite at the apple. It would be wonderful if our government was doing it for us. But at the moment, that seems not like low-hanging fruit. We as individuals can be doing this here and now. All right, so now I'm just going to stop for a moment. I don't see that I've got any questions or comments. I'm going to keep going, and I promise I will come up for questions in a few minutes. But I want to talk with you about this example, the idea of college admissions reform as an example of an attainable reform, something that we could do right here, right now. And what I want to do in the first instance is to introduce you to the idea that was mentioned in an article from just a year ago by David Grusky, Peter Hall, Hazel Rose Marcus. Grusky is a sociologist at Stanford, Hall, political scientist at Harvard, Marcus, a psychologist at Stanford. And the three of them came up with this idea that I think is really quite important. In a sense, it synthesizes what a lot of other people have been talking about. And it's the idea of an opportunity market. And what they suggest is that over the last 50 to 70 years, what is required to be a competitive applicant to a college or university is stuff that is sold on markets and that costs more and more. And so although we like to think of our college admissions process as being all about your grades and your test scores and your activities, and that stuff should just reflect your native abilities, what they demonstrate, and I think demonstrate quite convincingly, is that in fact, this is stuff that you've got to spend a lot of money to acquire. And so we should really think about this as a market in which those who have greater resources, of course, are going to be able to purchase more opportunity. And so they divide the market into 3 zones. These zones essentially refer to age groups. And the first zone is the early childhood, essentially preschool training. Some of this has to do with the importance of being able to afford to have one parent stay out of the job market during the first couple years of a child's life. And one of the things we know, right, psychologists know that Rose Marcus contributes to this study, is that early childhood development is the single most important place where cognitive and emotional development occurs, first 3 years of life. And so if you can afford to have a parent stay out of the workforce, and it's almost always, or at least usually the mother, if she is up to speed, reading those what to expect books, reading the parenting magazines, if she has been acculturated by a liberal arts college into certain ideas about how to treat a child, how to develop their vocabulary, how to encourage them to have a sense of confidence, of unconditional love, to stimulate their curiosity and their experimentation, they're going to have an advantage for the rest of their life. And people try to quantify this. It results in literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional earning potential across a life. So if you're in a position to do this, it's not only in many respects something many parents want to do, spend time with their children when they're young, but also an economically rational thing to do. Similarly, at this first zone, if you can, when your child gets to be 3, 4, 5 years old, send them to a high quality early childhood center or preschool program where they've got a small student to teacher ratio, where they've got the right kinds of facilities, where the teachers are well trained. This is not going over to an aunt's house for babysitting or a local neighborhood daycare center. This is a professionally run, well-managed early childhood center or preschool. Again, what we find is that children learn much better, are much better prepared. And by the way, when they get to school, they're already going to be socialized to be the kind of child that a teacher pays the most attention to, cultivates, really invests in educationally. They begin to develop at this age, 3 to 5 years old, the kinds of curiosity and engagement with knowledge, which will make them a good student for the next 15, 20 years. All right, zone 2 of opportunity markets refers to primary and secondary education. And the most obvious thing here is access to a high quality school. And although we could talk about private schools where the tuition is often not too far off from what it is to send a child to college, so obviously it's only the affluent who can afford that, we could just talk about the difference per pupil in expenditure in public schools in the United States. And that affluent white children attend schools where the amount spent per child is more than double what is spent in inner city schools where the students are primarily students of color and poor, right? And this affects, obviously, teacher to student ratio. It affects the quality of the infrastructure, whether the textbooks are up to date at one end to whether the toilets work at the other end, right? And so just access to a good school depends on being in the school district. And part of what we know is that depends on property value. It is actually the case today that the number one determinant of property value in the United States is not the square footage of the home as it used to be, but the quality of the school district that the home qualifies you to attend. That's more important than square footage for the value of a home. And so, in effect, when we include value, zoning, the cost of the home, the way in which the area is zoned to prevent often multi-unit dwellings, and property taxes, we essentially have invisibly gated communities around many of the best public schools in the United States. Either you're making a very high income to be able to afford to live there, to be able to afford the taxes, and you're zoning to keep other people out, right? To prevent diluting your property tax and other resources. Or else you're locked out and you're going to a bad quality public school. We could talk about everything else I've already mentioned, the chess and violin lessons, the private tutors, funding for the curated summer programs that allow a child to look really interesting in their application. There is all of that too, but all of this is at zone 2. Zone 3, I'll be very quick. This refers to early adult training. And there's research out that suggests that the single most important factor that leads already qualified candidates to get a job is having a good internship, right? So once you're in the door being considered for the job, having a good internship is perhaps the single most important factor. Who gets to have a good internship? Well, in part, someone who can afford to work for free, right? And that's whether you're doing it as a college student or immediately after you graduated. Most internships are either not paid or paid very low, but it's also the case that internships are primarily distributed by private networks. Does your father or mother know someone? Do they know someone who knows someone who might be able to give you an internship? Many of the internships in the United States are not formal internship programs. They're informal arrangements that are done as favors within social networks. And so at each of these 3 phases, I think the critical thing to see is that what we consider to be qualification, especially qualification to get into college or university, is something that you can't acquire without spending a lot of money. And so de facto, if not explicitly, implicitly, colleges and universities are saying you need to spend a lot of money to get your college admitted. To get your child admitted. Never mind that the college itself is going to cost a lot of money. And I now want to show you some data, and then I'll come back to the possible reforms that indicate what's going on here. This is how much the top 20% have been spending to enrich their child's experiences. So, right, this is not what they spend on school. This is what they spend on summer camp and private tutors, etc. And then the bottom 20%. And what you can see is that the bottom 20% spends a non-negligible amount, maybe on average around $1,000 a year from 1972 to 2006, and more in 2006 than they were spending in 1972. But the top 20% used to spend maybe 3 or 4 times as much. They're now spending 7 or 8 times as much as the bottom 20%. You can break it down further. And so this is looking at the top 10% versus the bottom 10%, where the it's become even more extreme. And right, this then produces results. And I find this diagram, in a sense, to be the most distressing of the diagrams about lack of opportunity. This takes test scores in the 8th grade and sorts out the bottom, the bottom 20% and the top 20% into 3 groups. Those who don't do well on tests, the low test scores, those who do all right but not great, and those who do particularly well. And what you see is that wealth is more predictive of college completion than is test scores. And the way you see this is because the best test takers among the poorest people in our society graduate college at a lower rate than the worst test takers among the richest people in our society. And right, so that's a kind of apples to oranges comparison, right? The best test takers compared with the worst test takers. What matters more is the wealth you have than how well you can do on tests. But if we do the apples to apples comparison, we can see that 29% of those who are in the poorest group who have the best test scores graduate from college, whereas 75% of the best test takers from the rich families graduate college. And so more than double the college completion rate, being explained not by testing ability, but simply by family wealth and what it can purchase. So another element of this, I'll just point to very briefly, is parental financial worry. And the reason we look at this is because we know that when parents are experiencing financial stress, they are distracted. They are often also short-tempered or aggressive. It undermines their capacity to be effective parents to their children. And you can see even people with a college degree or more are experiencing increased stress from the mid-1970s into the 2000s. But the stress level for those who have a high school degree or less has gone up dramatically, more than doubled over that same period. And this is then undermining their ability to parent well. This has to do with residential housing segregation. And I want you to focus for a minute just on 2 groups, the poor, right? In 1970, around 8.5% of Americans lived in neighborhoods that were poor. By 2009, it was more than double that amount, 18% essentially. If you look at the affluent neighborhoods, 1970, around 6 to 7% were living in affluent neighborhoods. In 2009, 15% were living. And so what you can see then is that around 2/3 of Americans were living in middle income neighborhoods in the 1970s. Today it's down to 42%. And this matters because peers socialize each other. And if you are primarily surrounded by poor people, lots of studies, both qualitative and quantitative, show that you're much less likely to get the message that education produces economic mobility. If you're in a mixed income neighborhood, you're rubbing up against not only poor kids, but also middle-class kids and maybe even some affluent kids. And they might convey to you things that your parents don't convey to you about the value of education. All right, so I see I've got a question. I'm going to stop for a minute. Obviously, I've been going on for quite a while. I'm going to unmute everyone, but Peggy, you get to go first. So just be ready. I'm unmuting you now in terms of background noise. Peggy, go ahead. Peggy, it looks like you're going to have to unmute yourself by hitting your space bar. Peggy, can you hear me?
So Peggy has an iPad and might need some assistance. Oh, here she is.
Okay, Peggy, go ahead. We can hear you now. Peggy, are you hearing me?
How do you know if she can't tell you?
Okay. I'm going to apologize to Peggy. Whenever you're able to, hold your space bar down and just talk. But I'm going to keep going until we are able to get your question shared with us. And you could also put it into the chat bar if that worked better. I'm going to continue leaving everyone unmuted so Peggy can come in and the rest of you can come in when you want. And try to keep the background noise down. Do I hear somebody? No, okay.
So, I have a comment.
Go ahead, please. Who is this?
John Campbell.
Oh, hi, John. I don't know why, but you're not popping up these days.
I'm just on a different screen, I guess. I see my picture. I'm interested in, this is totally a supporting another piece of the same puzzle in elementary schools or public schools in general, rather high schools and middle schools just as much, is the fact that even in terms of the regular finance of public schools, affluent ones in affluent neighborhoods get more money in general, but beyond that, in relatively affluent schools, the amount of money that's raised by parents or from foundation grants of some sort or other is enormous, and that kind of funds, of course, are not available to people with, in lower income schools, and with the inadequate funding of our public schools in general, that differential becomes enormous. And I wanted to mention in passing that there's a terrific podcast just started. It's called Nice White Parents. The first installment was also run on This American Life. It's by Hannah Jaffe Walters, the producer for This American Life, and now it's its own podcast. It's up to 3 installments now. But it starts off with a story. Well, I won't go into it, but for anyone that's at all interested in this, that is just an outstanding podcast. It's called Nice White Parents.
And I have not heard it yet, but I heard the promotion for it. And the promotion, I guess, indicates that the conclusion that somebody studying public schools came to is that the single factor that was most interfering with performance was white parents. And so I look forward to looking at that.
That statement takes a little qualification, but you're in the right place.
And John, I can't call you Gandalf anymore. It looks like you found a barber. Glad to see it. Let me get to the serious point that you've raised, and I'll give you an example. I'm going to mute everyone for the moment, and then I'll unmute you again. And you can unmute yourself pressing your space bar and holding it down. I know of a school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, when I lived in a building in the area, I heard about this from parents in the school who were kind of blown away by it, because the PTA set as an objective building a new library for the school, and within a few years had raised millions of dollars to literally physically purchase property in Manhattan and build a school library there, right? And so, yes, it is another dimension of the problem. And by the way, in the aftermath of this, the city limited the amount that parents can contribute to their school. It was standard practice, Upper East Side, Upper West Side, other affluent areas in Manhattan, for the PTA to fund assistant teachers for K through 5th grade, right? And so that if you went to a rich school, you were getting literally 2 to 1 the teacher to student ratio that you were getting if you went to a less affluent school. So yes, there are multiple ways, and I'm not suggesting that we can kill all the birds with one stone. This will take a multifaceted effort. but we need to be self-conscious as a society about the fact that we like to think of ourselves as a meritocracy, as a society where anybody who works hard and has the right skills and gifts can move up. But in practice, we're doing all of this stuff to make sure that the children of the affluent are inheriting their parents' privileges, their parents are purchasing it, and schools are increasingly becoming mechanisms for transmitting intergenerational privilege, not mechanisms for developing the culture, the humanity of the student. Let me complete the thought for the day. And so much for getting to the up high fruit, but at least let's complete the low hanging fruit. I'm not going to give you any more information on the nature of the unfairness of the competition to get into colleges. I was going to show you a little bit more about economic and racial segregation in our society, but leave that for another occasion. Let me talk with you about the reforms that Grusky, Hall, and Marcus discuss. And they discuss three possible kinds of reform. One of them would be equipping low-income families to compete by equalizing access to all stages of the opportunity markets. So leave the opportunity markets in place, but allow low-income students to get access to good preschool and good public schools and the kinds of activities. And as they point out, that this would be an incredibly ambitious and expensive enterprise. And it would be one that would no doubt be resisted by rich parents because it would involve giving the poor kids every advantage and hence mitigating the competitive advantage that comes from all these expenditures. That they estimate that billions of dollars would have to be spent per year to equalize access to the things that rich parents are currently purchasing for their kids. The second idea would be the fair public provision of the goods currently sold on opportunity markets, and universal pre-K, universal kindergarten, universal funding, equal funding of public schools, equalizing the teacher to student ratio, the quality of the infrastructure. This might be stuff that, like me, many of you are totally in favor of. It doesn't mean we're not in favor of it when we say it's not low-hanging fruit. It's not something that can be done readily and quickly, right? And so Grusky, Hall, and Marcus say, by all means, hold out for that kind of reform, but don't wait, because if you wait until that reform is done, you may be waiting forever, or you may be waiting 25 years and you've given up on an entire generation of kids who don't have the resources to afford this stuff now. So their third proposal, the one that they think is the one that's really attainable here and now, is to eliminate unfair competition by reforming the college admissions process. And the basic idea here, let me start with their proposal and then we can expand out a little bit. The basic idea would be right now, and I didn't show you this data, I can show it with you, but let me actually show you a little bit because it's so stunning. The number of children who attend the most selective schools that come from a low income background is vanishingly small. And so if you look at this diagram, right, from the top 0.1% of incomes in our society, that's where most of the kids who go to the Ivy, the elite, the highly selective, and the selective colleges come from. And as you can see, if you drop down to the 1%, they're still going mainly to the elite, highly selective, and selective schools and the Ivies. You get down to the top 5%, and you're already seeing a diminution of the number of kids in the selective colleges. you drop down still to the top 20%. And as you can see, you've got a growing number going to the not selective colleges. Now drop down to the middle class, right? This is the middle of society. Very few go to Ivy or elite, and not too many, less than a third go to even the selective colleges, right? Whereas a large portion are going to the non-selective or not going to college at all. Those are the middle class kids, right? And then you get down to the bottom 20%, and as you can see, 2/3 of them are not in college by age 22, right? The majority who are in college are going for 2 years or less. A tiny little sliver is going to the Ivy, the elite, or the highly selective, around 10% going to the selective colleges. So when I say that college admissions in the United States has become a luxury good, that's what I'm reflecting on. So what Grusky, Hall, and Marcus propose is that if colleges want to have economic diversity, they need to have a stratified admission process. Admit 10% of the top 10%. Admit 10% of the bottom 10%, and et cetera going through. Now, that would be ideal, I think, a kind of mirroring of the economic diversity in our society, in our selective and highly selective and elite colleges and universities. It would be hard. It would take much more than reforming the admissions process, because it would also take furnishing the kids who come from the bottom 10% with the kinds of educational resources to allow them to compete and succeed with kids who've had much better education. It would ultimately put the colleges and universities in the United States in the position of having to lobby very strongly for improving the education of the poor in the United States. It would also be hard socially, mixing these kids from these very different backgrounds. And I'm not suggesting that we pull a switch and do this overnight. We've got to get the colleges and universities enlisted in the project. We've got to get them prepared to do it so it succeeds. So maybe we don't do complete mirror representation in the first year or two, but it does seem to me that colleges and universities that consider themselves to be liberal institutions, to cultivate diversity, to be a place where mobility is fairly available, need to look in the mirror and see what they're actually doing, and then figure out how they can change. And again, this is something that does not require the federal government involvement at all. And I would note that in a knowledge economy, access to higher education, I won't share the data with you, but there's very strong data to support this, is absolutely critical to economic mobility and one's overall economic standing in society. All right, I will stop there. Who wants to start us off with some questions? I've unmuted everyone, so just push your space bar and talk. Go ahead, Kwasi.
Good. In the, that's a long time ago, but at Lowell High School, we used to send our brightest kids, but also kids who, like Emil Guillermo, Vanjie knows him very well, was a sparkling, feisty, mischievous, brilliant Filipino kid. When he graduated from, I think it was Harvard, he spent 4 years there, and he joined the Hasty Pudding Society because he was so, they let him give the Hasty Pudding speech. And the first thing he said, introducing himself and being a master of ceremonies too, today I have learned that I am a Filipino. Let me say that again. This is upon graduation. Today, I learned that I am a Filipino. In other words, he was imitating the sound of Filipino or speech where people have not overcome their the speech patterns that give them away.
Right.
I think that um, Emil's education is one of he's a grandfather now, I think, but he had a rough time because we didn't prepare him for Harvard. And I think by saying preparing him, making him ready for the kind of excellent education he would be receiving, but not with the loving care we gave him all. So his first composition in English by a very good teacher, I could see it because he showed me his paper. The first thing that his teacher said was, Guillermo, you can't get away with this. And he wrote him up and down the page, pointing out every law he had been broken. We, in our innocence, because Harvard would accept him based on our recommendation, didn't realize how tough it would be for those kids who came from having grown up in the mission and having been sheltered and admired by a San Francisco education system.
So,
making sure that he had clothes enough, but not anticipating the beating he would take.
so let me jump in there, Fossey, and thank you for sharing the story. And I'll just say something that I think develops or builds on the story you just shared. And I want to talk for a minute about a nationwide program that tries to prepare kids like the child you're mentioning, obviously no longer a child, to compete for the best colleges and universities. This program is called Posse Comitatus, right? And so it's a posse program. And what they do is they take groups of 20 kids from inner cities and sometimes from the same school, sometimes from diverse schools, but they bring them all together. And for 3 or 4 years, they say, here's what you're learning in school. Here's what you would need to learn if you're going to go to the best colleges or universities in the United States. And they know that colleges and universities are interested in kids who come from a disadvantaged background who can actually do the work and succeed at the college. So they've got a kind of a hot commodity once they train these 20 kids. And they say to the college and universities, if you want to admit one, you have to admit all, right? You have to take the whole group into your college or university. And part of the reason they say that is because one of the things that the research finds is you put a single kid from a disadvantaged background, especially if they're a racial minority, into a Harvard or a Yale or a Stanford, and they feel not only academically out of their depth, but socially incredibly isolated. You put 20 kids at Stanford and they have their own group. They already know each other. They support each other. They can cope together with what's sometimes called the ordeal of integration. And so, yes, if we were to do what Grusky, Hall, and Marcus propose, one of the things we would be doing right away, in a sense, is making sure that 10% of every class at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Sarah Lawrence was from an economically disadvantaged background. They would support each other and they would support would need to be supported by the colleges and the universities as well. Thank you for that, Flossie. I've unmuted everyone again. So just beware that your background noise will be picked up. Anybody have another question or comment?
Yeah, I have a comment on that. This is Matt Mitchell. I interviewed a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He happened to be a black guy.
I don't know why.
And are you?
It was working.
I interviewed him, and he
We got
talked.
a little background noise. Go ahead.
He talked about the crab mentality. I said, "What's that?" He says, "Well, it's like a bunch of crabs in a bucket. One crab tries to crawl out, and the other crabs pull it back in." And the analogy was to try to get black kids to want to try to improve themselves in the educational system, and try to do better was considered to be very uncool. And that was something cultural that really kind of worked against this whole matter of progress. I'm hoping that when you get a whole bunch of kids finally at college, that it works the other way around. But just getting kids to want to be educated is the first step, it seems to me.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and so I'll speak a little bit from my own autobiographical background here. I went to school in Sonoma, California for 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade. So for those 4 years. Before that, I'd been going to school in Oakland, and then I came back and went to school in Richmond, California. When I was those 4 years in the country, it was uncool. You got picked on, you got bullied if you were smart, right? And that wasn't a race thing. That was a rural thing. These were almost all white kids, right? And so the white kids were bullying other white kids who were smart. It was such a relief to get to Richmond, California, to an inner city school, but a magnet school that had a college prep track. My Sonoma High School didn't even have a college prep track, and to find that actually I had peers who would engage with ideas with me, that it wasn't uncool to be smart. So yeah, there are lots of things we've got to do here. But I do think that this idea that any good college or university should have roughly the same socioeconomic proportions as our society has is an incredibly important idea. And in a sense, it mitigates some of these other problems, right? You're not making people from the bottom 20% compete with people from the top 20%, where the parents from the top 20% are spending $10,000 a year getting their kids ready to compete, right? You make them only compete with each other or themselves, not across the strata, and that makes much fairer access possible, it seems to me. Thank you for the story, Matt. Anybody else? All right, so I will be talking with you. Let me just share with this with you for a moment. Next week about some ideas. This is the stuff on what, by the way, going to a good school does to a poor child. You can see that their economic outcomes, if they go to an Ivy Plus or an elite college, get them up close to the top of society. It actually matters very little that they came from a poor background. If they get the good education, they do very well. Next week, I'll be talking with you about tax reform, reparations, universal basic income, fair equality of opportunity. There's a lot of moonshot projects as well for restoring equality in the United States. That's where we'll go next week. And then we'll be on to talking about what's happening politically, economically, and in terms of health in our society, before starting a new lecture series on racial justice. Take care, everybody. Please continue to be safe, be smart, be happy and funny, as I know you do. I'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.